Chapter 1 The Birth, 1853. There was nothing particularly special about this day. Big Carl Baker was sitting in front of Kerr's general store like he often did. His straw hat tilted over his eyes, blocking the morning sun, his chair tilted back against the wall, feet on the hitching post. This was Saturday, so his son Little Carl was with him wearing his straw hat and trying to sit like his dad, but his feet wouldn't reach the railing because his 6-year-old legs weren't long enough yet. He kept his legs straight anyway because he wanted to be like his dad. Big Carl looked at Little Carl out of the corner of his eye. He loved his son, and he could see his son loved him. They didn't say much to each other. They just continued sitting there, listening to the robins and other birds singing while brushing away the occasional annoying fly. Their quiet time was suddenly disrupted when young Jim Perry ran up on the porch and into the store yelling for Mr. Kerr as he went. Big Carl and his son rolled out of their chairs and were right behind Jim to see what all the commotion was about. "Mr. Kerr! Mr. Kerr! I need some supplies, quick! Mama's about to give birth, and Aunt Lynetta gave me a list of things she will need." Mr. Kerr came out of the back room with his wife Mabel right beside him. Mrs. Mabel Kerr was a happy little lady. Her gray-streaked hair, held in its usual tight bun, exposed even more of her smiling face. Next to her 6'2" husband George, she looked tiny. Mrs. Kerr was a teacher in Scotland before they moved to Canada 7 years ago. She now teaches at the one-room Elmstead Pew Settlement School, where there is a multicultural mixture of students. The students love her, and even though sometimes she seems strict, she is always fair. She also brings the children treats from the general store. Just like at school, Mrs. Kerr immediately took charge. "You say your mama's about to have the baby now? Dr. Clare said this baby wasn't due for another month. Guess God had other plans. Anyway, Little Carl, you go fetch Doc Clare in case there are complications and Aunt Lynetta needs some help. George, will you help young Jim with whatever he needs? I'll be right back. I'm going with you, young Jim. Just give me a minute." Mabel disappeared in the back, taking her apron off as she went. Her husband looked at her with love in his eyes. His Mabel always knew how to organize everyone. He then turned to young Jim, put a hand on his shoulder, and said in his thick Scottish accent, "Well, Jimbo, let's get the things you need. Give me that list of Aunt Lynetta's. This day looks like it's going to be a very special one for the Perry family." About 5 minutes later, with young Jim leading the way and Mrs. Kerr and Big Carl following, the three headed to the Perry farm. Mr. Kerr stayed back minding the store while Little Carl had gone to get Dr. Clare. The group turned down the long wooded path leading to the Perry farmhouse located next to the Pike Creek. When they arrived, young Jim's grandfather, White Cloud, who was called a Doo-Doo, the Cherokee Indian name for grandfather, was standing out front with 14-year-old Fred Anderson. Fred waved to young Jim as they approached. "Hey, young Jim, Aunt Lynetta is inside with Margaret tending to your mama." Mrs. Kerr told the rest of them to stay outside as she grabbed the bag of supplies from young Jim and went through the front door. Inside the dimly lit log home, Mrs. Kerr quietly approached the bedside of Kezar Perry, located in the far corner of the room next to the fireplace. "Hello, Aunt Lynetta and Margaret. How's Kezar doing?" "Mama's doing fine, Mrs. Kerr," Margaret said. Mrs. Kerr liked Margaret because at school she was always helping with the smaller children. They had a mutual respect for each other, and Margaret had told her she also wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. Margaret felt that when she got older and married Fred Anderson, that would be a good time to become a teacher with Mrs. Kerr. Margaret was only 12, so she knew her and Fred still had a lot of time to plan their life together. Aunt Lynetta was kneeling down next to Kezar, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. Lynetta was Kezar's older sister, and they had married brothers. Henry Perry was Kezar's husband, and they had named their second-born son after his older brother, Jim. The two families lived on neighboring farms and spent a lot of time together, working and socializing. Today, like every Saturday, the brothers, along with Henry and Kezar's oldest son, Joseph, had hitched up their wagon to a team of horses and taken a load of their farm goods to the farmers' market in Windsor. Another farmer and friend, John Freeman Walls, would also travel beside them with a wagon load of his famous apples. Aunt Lynetta looked up at Mrs. Kerr. "Thank you for coming, Mabel. Kezar has been working around here all morning, preparing a good dinner for our husbands when they return from the market. I told her, 'Child, you better sit down and let me and Margaret take care of this. You know Dr. Clare said that this was an especially sensitive pregnancy and you need a lot of rest. because this baby seems a little bigger than your first three." "Well, you know Kazar," Mrs. Kerr said. "She always wants to make sure everyone is happy and, of course, well fed. When we heard the news, we rushed right over. I sent little Carl Baker to go and get Dr. Clare to help with this delivery." "Good idea, because this will need both of us," Aunt Lynetta said. Mabel Kerr moved closer to the bed. "How are you feeling, Kazar?" "Tolerable, Mabel. This baby in my belly has got to be a boy. He's a squirmy little thing, and he sure can kick," Kazar answered weakly. Mabel patted Kazar on her hand. "Well, we are going to bring him out real soon so he can meet his family." She then turned to Aunt Lynetta. "Here are the supplies you wanted." Just as she said that, Dr. Clare walked in carrying his black doctor's bag. "Good morning, ladies. It looks like we're going to be welcoming the newest member to our community." "Hello, Dr. Clare," the three said in unison. "Well, Mrs. Perry, how are you feeling?" "I'm fine, Doctor." "I see Aunt Lynetta and Margaret have everything ready, so let's have a baby," Dr. Clare said, opening his bag. Outside the tiny log cabin, all the men and boys were waiting anxiously for the news. Little Carl was sitting on Chief White Cloud's lap, listening to him tell stories about his native North American ancestors and how they lived in the old days. He was born in the Cherokee Nation and was a very proud man. This was a great occasion for him because his daughter, Kazar, was inside this little log cabin, ensuring that his Cherokee blood would continue in this land with the birth of his fourth grandchild. She was lucky to have married a good man like Henry Perry. He had come to Canada on the Underground Railroad with his brother Jim, and they have been great providers for their families. They are honest, hard-working men, and they were teaching those values to the children. Fred Anderson and Big Carl Baker were leaning against the old oak tree in the front yard talking while young Jim Perry was leisurely swinging and spinning on the swing that hung from the big branch overhead. "When do you want my brothers and me to come over to take off the corn in your fields?" Fred asked Big Carl. Ever since Big Carl had his heart attack last fall, he wasn't able to operate his farm alone. Fred's father had told Big Carl his sons wanted to come and help with this year's harvest. "Tuesday would be fine. My wife Belinda and I were just talking about that this morning. Thanks again, Fred, to you and your brothers. Tell your father next Sunday after church we want him, your mother, Miss Laura, and the rest of the family to come over for dinner. Little Carl likes when you boys come and play wrestle with him. He always says he wants to grow up to be big and strong like the Anderson boys." At that moment, Margaret came out on the porch and announced, "It's a boy! I have another brother!" Everybody ran to the house. They waited until Aunt Lynetta invited them in one by one to see the little newborn. "What's his name, Margaret?" Fred asked. "Since Pa gets to pick the boy's name, Mama says he's going to be William." Later that night, sitting in front of the fireplace, Henry Perry held his new baby boy, rocking him gently and talking to him. "Well, son, you are strong and healthy. We thank God for that and hope you have a long and happy life." The next morning, word of the new birth quickly spread through the Elmstead Pugh settlement. The Scotts, Ellsworths, Hollands, Smiths, Lands, Johnsons, Walses, and others came to see the new addition to the Perry family and to drop by some food. Fred and Margaret were by the old oak tree watching their friends come and go. "Having a baby is a big occasion, ain't it, Margaret? How many children you think we're going to have when we get married?" Fred asked. "Who said I'm going to marry you?" Fred began laughing. "Well, if you don't marry me, your daddy is going to make you marry crazy Mr. Jones, who lives at the end of Old Mill Road. He's only about 100 years old and he doesn't have a wife." "Very funny. You better take that back, Mr. Fred Anderson," Margaret said as she began chasing him around the tree.